Hello, everyone. I'm Bobtheorc, and today I want to welcome my friend Paul. Paul is a international businessman based out of Munich, Germany. He is involved in various real estate and aviation industries. And today we're going to talk about why stuff keeps falling off of Boeing airplanes.
Exactly.
There you go, Paul. How you been? I haven't seen you in a while.
I'm doing pretty well. I can't complain. Life's pretty good.
So, um, let's uh, let's just dive right in. What's going on with Boeing, and how come that guy just got Epsteined?
I think to understand the problems that Boeing is having, we have to have a little history lesson about Boeing.
All
I
right.
think that's the part of the story that tends to be ignored sometimes. You have to give credit where credit is due. Boeing was the aviation company for decades. A lot of the engineering that they did was industry leading, changed the world, and many of the planes they made before the present time are to this day absolute masterpieces. And no one's denying that. I think if you want to pinpoint the exact problems with Boeing, you have to go back to the merger with McDonnell Douglas in 1996. Um, that's a whole discussion that doesn't need to be had, but that is the beginning of the bad news. And that is because that is when the accountants took charge. The engineers used to run Boeing, and that is when the accountants took charge. And that is where the problems began.
Now, is
And
this
there was
when they changed when they moved out of Washington, or is
oh,
this
I was yeah, that came right after
okay?
because what started with McDonnell Douglas was you had a non-Boeing culture. Boeing had a really cool culture. They were a bunch of, lumberjack type guys in Seattle in the mountains that were going screwing planes together. And it worked fantastically. And McDonnell had a very different culture. And there was a clash of cultures and people went head to head and whatever. They took McDonnell Douglas's failed accountants and put them in charge of Boeing. That's basically how that happened. And some of the subsequent events were really significant. And the biggest one is exactly what you just mentioned. 2001, Boeing moved its headquarters from Seattle to Chicago.
Why'd they do that? Because that never made any sense to me. Because I mean, who the hell wants to live in Chicago anyway?
Uh, I can't give you a good answer for that. I don't think that they had a good answer for that. They did it. I think that they really pushed this merger through, and I think that
Was McDonnell Douglas based out of Chicago previously, or
I really can't give you a good answer for that. But it wasn't a coincidence. I think that a big part of Boeing's white collar force was from McDonnell, and I think there was some issue with going to Washington for them. I think that was a factor here. I think that they also wanted to kind of separate. Well, when they created kind of a new culture from this canceled Boeing culture and the McDonnell culture that came into the picture. They created kind of a new corporate language, and to make enough people happy, I think they redefined it. And part of what they did was they separated business guys from the engineers. And again, that was the problem because the engineers were running the company before. It's kind of like an analogy I like to make as a car guy. It's like Mercedes in the 90s. Engineers used to run the thing. Admittedly, they went into some financial problems because they spent too much. Uh, not that didn't quite happen to Boeing the same way, but they made awesome machines, and those,
imagine Germans overbuilding German things?
yeah, it doesn't take much to imagine that.
Y'all kind of have a history of that.
Yeah, these are the people that invented the automatically adjusted rearview mirror, so it had a memory function.
Yeah.
Because the whole purpose, it's a brief segue, but you have a memory function, because when your wife drives the car, it's so irritating. You get back in, you can't get the thing in the position. Well, they have a solution. That was the German idea, the solution for everything. No, Boeing was really well, it's not a luxury brand. They had a solution for problems that existed, and they were very good at solving them. The engineers had the rule, and then when the bean counters took over, when McDonnell got involved, that went downhill. And the emphasis really it was cost cutting in the primary stage, but the real goal was just to make money for shareholders, which is a good goal for us. That's actually the mission of any corporation.
Right.
But when you focus too much on making the money and the profits, and you don't focus on actually making the products that are driving that, you last a little while, and then shit really hits the
Yeah,
fan.
because
And
long term you've got a
yeah,
balance between the quality and the profits, and if you have all quality and no profit, you go out of business, and if you have all profit and no quality, then you go out of business.
yeah. Let me just mute that. Maybe one sec.
You're popular today.
The phone's been ringing off the hook. Yeah. No, because when people order a certain product from you, they're kind of banking off of your previous products, the previous performance you've done, and that has an impact. So Boeing's success after the merger was really for years just people assuming that they're going to continue making the wonderful planes they used to make. And there's several reasons that didn't happen. The accounting taking over is part of that, but the story became much deeper because what they started doing is selling off different branches of their company. They used to have plants all across the US, and they still have several plants across the US, but they used to have many more. They used to have different divisions. And is it called Spirit Aerosystems or Aerospace, but whatever Spirit is, they were one of Boeing's companies. They made fuselages, and they would put them on trains and very efficiently move them either to North Carolina or to Washington for final assembly. And that is when we talk about this door flying off recently. That's where the problem occurred, and that was a former Boeing facility. It got privatized, and now they're talking about maybe they'll buy it back. All
Well,
types of
haven't
stuff.
they had a number of other problems just within the last week or so,
Oh yeah, that I don't even know where to begin.
like wheels falling off and
Yeah, well, that was almost, I say almost, its own issue. Um, but what you really have across the board, and this door is honestly kind of a coincidence. It's a good example, but you have just bad quality. You have bad quality because you have no creativity. You have really bad decision making. Selling off parts of production is just not really a good idea. When you buy a car, the stereo is made somewhere else. The tires aren't made in the factory, but they make the major components and they assemble it. That's your car company doing it in its facilities, and that's how it makes money because you can make money doing that efficiently.
right the
If
vertical integration that Henry Ford came up with.
Exactly. If you can't make that profitable, I mean, you have to rethink your whole strategy. There's no way you can't make money doing that unless you're really messing up. And if you are messing it up that badly, selling those things off isn't going to save you. It's just going to dig a deeper hole, and that's what Boeing's starting to find out. And while that's one way to kind of point the blame, that was a really bad sequence of events, really bad decisions. The other problem is that somewhere along the line, they stopped innovating. And the only innovation they really carried out since I want to say the mid 90s, right around the time McDonald came into the picture, is they made the Dreamliner. The
Now, is the
Dreamliner,
Dreamliner actually dreamy, or is it not so dreamy? Because I've flown on them, it seemed nice.
yeah, I mean, listen, when things work well, the concept is a good one. That was a plane that was needed. You see, to make a fresh design for a plane is a huge undertaking. It's a huge investment, and all the manufacturers try to avoid that. They try to just rebrand and refurbish existing models as much as they can. But every once in a while, you do need something new. Boeing needed to replace its relatively small long haul planes they were making. They still make, to an extent, I think they're going to stop soon, the 767. The 757 is a fantastic plane they stopped making years ago. The 777 is good, but the 777, people don't realize, is humongous. And
Yeah,
they
it,
need
it's a
something.
big it is a big plane.
Yeah, especially the stretched version that they made in the late '90s, which to me is one of the last good planes they made. 777 is a fantastic plane, and it's huge. And they needed something more efficient. They needed something smaller, something more versatile,
Now, is
and
the
that
777 bigger than the 747 even, or not quite?
so not quite. Um, the 777 in its so it has the shorter configuration. The original was this 777-200,
All right.
and it's easy if you count the doors. It has 8 doors, and that was pretty popular with the Japanese carriers and carriers like United in the U.S. They also used it for domestic for that
But
reason.
the seating is really wide. I mean, I was on one late
That's where it
last.
is.
Yeah, I
The
was on one
width,
late last year, and it was really
yeah,
wide.
the width is just about that of the 747.
Yeah,
If you try, you can fit 10 abreast in economy, which pretty much only the 747 can do. In addition to that, and the 777 300 ER that came out just a few years later in the mid 90s, and that is a monster. That's 10 doors, so you add an entire another section to it. If you have a pretty lean configuration, you can put more than 400 people in it.
yeah,
And a luxurious configured 747 has less than that, so they kind of overlap. It's all about the configuration when you talk
yeah.
about capacity. But that's kind of missing the point. These were huge planes, and the 777 had great range, but it was if you can't fill the plane, it's just not efficient to take it anywhere. They wanted something smaller where you could fill it, maybe with less demand, um, and not break the bank, especially with rising fuel costs. This was really also around the time when they started realizing that point to point travel can make sense.
Right.
Uh, the big behemoth planes were a product of the heyday of the hub and spoke model, which the world is never going to get away from. They've tried. Direct flights are cool. They're going to be more popular. We need small planes to operate them, but you also need the big ones. Either way, that's another topic. The
Yeah.
the Dreamliner got developed, it got made, and for the most part, it was going pretty well. They had some good ideas, and the problem was the execution. It was slow. It was filled with problems. They outsourced a lot of things, and it wasn't that the outsourcing was a problem, like making engines and wings compatible with each other and things like that. It was mainly a teamwork type problem. People weren't talking to each other enough. There was miscommunication. There were issues. You had a variety of delays because of these issues. It just kind of got more and more escalated, so that by the time the plane came out, it wasn't really competitive in the way it should have been. Airbus started a few years later developing its A350, which is a pretty comparable plane, and it's been extremely successful as well. They ended up flying around the same time, but here's the key point: Airbus charges much more for that plane than the Dreamliner. The Dreamliner has less features, and therefore it's not really the same plane. It's the Airbus is the premium option, and the Dreamliner is the cheaper one. And airlines will quite often, if you look at Lufthansa, take both in their fleet and tailor them to their specific needs. But Boeing missed that mark of competing. And the other thing that Boeing did is that they decided, okay, this is the plane. This is going to be our super awesome new plane. This is going to work, and we're going to base everything else we do off of it. And what they should have done was had a little bit better, envisioning and thinking here about the rest of the fleet and how they're individual planes and how perhaps they need to do something about that. Uh, because the whole thing we're talking about here, when we talk about planes crashing and killing everybody on board and doors flying off, it's usually a problem related to the 737. And that is a rather simple story. The 737 was a game changer. It came out at the beginning of the jet age in the 70s. It made really operations for airlines easy. And one of the big features was that it was a jet. It seated 150 plus people.
All right.
It was reliable, well made, all the qualities you want to see in an airplane. And one feature stood out though because it was the beginning of the jet age. Many small fields operated. It wasn't 747. It went to small places. Many of these places didn't have jet bridges. They didn't have all this fancy ground equipment. So they made the plane really low to the ground. And you can see that if you look at a 737, you compare it to even planes
Oh yeah,
smaller
no,
than it.
it's
It's
because
physically low.
and they've got a reasonably good range. You can park it on the tarmac. You walk up the
Exactly.
stairs. No, I think somewhere I've got a picture. I'll see if I can find. I think I'm pretty sure when I flew to Moscow back in October, I took from Istanbul to Moscow was a 737. It was an old janky, no
Yeah.
frills. Are we gonna die? 737. And
The old ones, they're
but it
efficient.
worked.
They get
It worked. It worked. We just went up a little staircase, and you
yeah.
know, you don't get
And
pretzels, but they give you alcohol.
there you go.
Yeah.
And but you can load any plane by stair, but it was low also because the ground workers could reach all the panels without a ladder.
Yeah.
Most planes they need all this extra stuff. You can load it. I think if they drive a fuel truck up to it, they can just hook up the hose. They don't need to climb on a lift,
Yeah.
ladders. It makes that easier. So, but that's the problem also because this airframe, this design has been around for, I mean, almost I think more than 50 years now,
Yeah, yeah.
right? This is an old concept, and its competitor in the primary, line of attack here is the Airbus A320. And that plane is, once again, just like the A350 and the Dreamliner, they're not really comparable. They're kind of a different category. And part of the reason is just because the Airbus is newer. They developed that plane in the late 80s and they put it in the air in the
Now
90s.
is that also low to
And
the ground?
well, that's the thing. It does the same job. It transports around the same amount of people. It uses actually the same engines in many cases. And uh, it, however, is much higher up because in the 90s, they had jet bridges everywhere. They had fancy equipment. They didn't really need the plane to be as accessible as the 737 was. So it's a very similar plane, but with newer technology from the 90s, which Boeing, they kind of addressed that. It was still technology wise even, but it's higher up and it had room for future improvement because the airframe itself is today, pushing 35,
Right.
and whereas Boeing's isn't, and it was made with a more modern purpose in mind. So now, when they want to develop these planes, right now, you can fit more seats in, but that's seat design. The actual airplane, they're making lighter materials, they're getting them involved, they have a little bit fancier computers. But what they really have, where they really make the things competitive, is with engines. And it's not, I mean, not that it's easy to do in a car, but you can't just swap in a newer engine design an old plane. It doesn't work like that. It doesn't
Really?
work with certification. Yeah, I mean, the physical engine can be replaced with another one of the same kind, but you can't have an entirely different model running it. And that makes sense because the characteristics
Even
are
if it
different.
fits in the even if it'll fit in the same engine housing.
So the engine, I mean, yeah, so you can replace the engine housing. I mean, it would have to be really similar. I don't know the specifics, but in general, when planes are made, there's different options to choose from. I know the A320 has three. Of the old version, the A320 CEO has three engine options.
Hmm.
One's made by IAE, which is a consortium of Pratt and Whitney, some Japanese company, and MTU, which is German. There's Rolls-Royce, which itself is also a consortium involving other companies. All these engines are made by joint ventures. And there's also there's CFM, of course. CFM is also an option for the 737. The airlines will pick, and if they need to replace it, they will. But uh, you can't upgrade them. And part of the reason also is because new engines are humongous.
Yeah.
If you look at jet engines over the years, they've gotten wider and wider and wider.
Well,
That's the bypass.
and that has to do with the fuel efficiency. I think they try to keep them going about 600 miles an hour or less, and something about how the wider engine they're not the turbojet anymore. They're a turbofan or they're I don't.
Exactly. I mean, it's all about the bypass ratio. The
Yeah.
giant fan in the front is a fan, and the middle part of that air will go through compressors and hit a flame and get compressed and burned, and that'll create thrust.
Right.
Most of the air will bypass it and it'll just pass through the engine and not be burned and not have anything happen to it. And the amount of air that doesn't get burned saves money because it's still being pushed. And so they've been able to increase that with their designs, and now it's up to about 90%. 90% of the air bypasses the combustion in modern jet
No
engines.
kidding. I didn't realize it was
Yeah,
that much.
exactly, and it didn't used to be. It used to be half of the day, and but you need room to do that. The
Because
engines
was it
are huge.
because it was the 727 had the little narrow long engines that were super fast, right? Or my or
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I mean, and speed. Planes fly around the same speed. If they slow down today, it's in the moment to save extra money usually.
right, but
But
there's an optimum speed where you balance your efficiency with wind resistance and
yeah,
versus how much energy it takes to go any faster. And there's because as you start
exactly.
approaching supersonic, the amount of energy starts really going up,
Oh yeah.
and you get vibrations and all kinds of other problems.
Yeah, so cruising speed is calculated once they're at cruising altitude.
Hmm.
It's a factor of the speed of sound. Those are Mach numbers.
Yeah,
For smaller planes, they're usually a little bit less than zero point 0.8.
yeah.
Uh, if you have a very generous airline willing to spend more on gas, the bigger planes can do 0.85 or even more. Um,
But once you start
it's
going above that, you start getting a really sharp cutoff in your efficiency. I think, right?
yeah, it's also the planes physically aren't rated to do it. It's a whole different game when you go supersonic. No, but you know the general processing is it looks around the same. No, the point is these modern engines they just very simply they burn less gas, and they need room to do it. Those new CFM Leap 1 were one of the engine options for the 737 MAX, and I think also for the A320neo. They're more than 6 feet wide.
Yeah.
And if you look at the fuselage of a 737 or even an A320, it's not that much bigger than that.
Well,
I don't know
and
how.
especially on these lower airplanes, I've noticed that the engine housings will be round, but then they're kind of flat on the bottom, so they don't bump against the ground. It looks like.
Exactly. Pretty much, yeah. Well, but that was the thing with the 737 MAX. The 737 MAX should have never existed. That was a design. It was great until its applications, the 800, the 900, but not the MAX. The MAX is a plane that should not have been made. They should have made a new, fresh design to really compete. And the reason they didn't do it is because they didn't realize they had this problem until it was really too late to do it in a competitive way. Airbus made their A320. Airbus was making the A320neo. They were selling everything well, and Boeing had to make something quickly that wasn't a clean sheet design to compete. And their way was to put these new huge engines on their 737, which it's a
Which was
stopgap. It's a
now.
shitty
When did the
solution.
737 Max come out? Because that was a while ago, right?
Yeah, they had the idea a while ago. I want to say they've been in commercial service for around 6 years now, give or
Okay.
take. But this it's been floating around for a while. Everything takes a long time, especially with Boeing these days, to actually make it into the air. But the key point here is at the beginning we had those two fatal crashes, and those happened because Boeing couldn't just fit those engines under the wing. There wasn't room. So they made this design where you have the wing, and do it like that. Normally the engine would be under it,
All right.
and they moved it in front and up,
Yeah.
and this created enough room for it. And of course, that really changed the way the plane flew.
It changes the
It flew
balance
high
point
up.
also.
Exactly. However, to make the plane competitive, they had to compete with Airbus. Airbus has the advantage that their new planes, their old planes, everything in the A320 family is pretty much give or take one certification for a pilot because crew training is very expensive for airlines.
Right.
Boeing had to make this plane fly the same way, and their solution was to tweak the software to make the plane feel the same. And especially, Airbus wouldn't even be surprised because they're good at playing with software. Boeing has the reputation of being a pilot's plane. It's a manual machine. And so this was something Boeing had no experience doing. They really shouldn't have done it, and they were doing it to cut that corner. The bottom line, they didn't do it right. They didn't spend nearly enough engineering man hours to pull something like that off. And that system that was going to tweak the plane's performance didn't work. And in two instances that we know of, it pitched the plane down, compensate for something that actually didn't happen because the system wasn't coded right, and the plane nosedived into the ground and killed hundreds of people. Those were
Right.
the two crashes in the beginning. That's where the problem, started. And then they fixed the problem. They did a software update. In theory, that's fine. Now you have the doors are flying off. Boeing can't keep up with the necessary engineering in terms of putting man hours into development really simply, and they don't have the resources and the teamwork and communication to effectively assemble these planes anymore because they don't make things themselves. And when
So
they don't,
if they need to change a component, they can't just change the component. They have to pass it through their supply chain and hope their suppliers make the changes they want, or
I mean, yeah, to a point, it's more of just they have the specifications for what their suppliers should be making, but of course, the burden still falls on them to check that it's being done, and those checks aren't really being done in a very effective way. The specifications might not even be good, and they might not even be noticing that. Not to mention that there's a lot of stages here when you move things out of a factory and separate assembly from the other stages of production. Uh, there has to be some really clear guidelines on how the assembly takes place and how the parts and what format they're in. And this is important with screws in particular and rivets of airliners. And then you see where I'm going with this with the door.
right.
Um, there are screws, nuts, and bolts, and all that good stuff, holding everything in place. And when you assemble everything at once, you have the advantage, and nothing's ever assembled at once, but when you really keep it under as few roofs as possible, everything is done, you know, kind of for final use at the same time. If you
Right.
make a door panel in Arkansas and then you put it on a truck, and then you put it somewhere else, and then you put it in a plane, but the plane is just a tube, and then you ship it across the country, and then you put all if you separate all these steps, those screws holding everything together um, might not be the same screws that you use to fly with. That's why they paint these are like assembly use only screws. They're red. And this was also a problem early in the Dreamliner days. They found right before the planes were going to be delivered, wait a second, the wing is full of red screws. We have to swap all these out because this isn't actually meant to be flying. And then the plane got delayed another few months. Uh, and that was kind of what happened with this door here. They put these door filler panels. It's essentially it's room for a door that most airlines don't need because most airlines aren't Ryanair. That was a door made for Ryanair because if you stuff enough people on a plane, you need extra exits. Otherwise, they can't get out
Right.
in a vacuum. That's that story. So they would fill them up with these filler panels, and when they made this fuselage, it wasn't anywhere near actually becoming a plane. So they just popped it in there, and I don't know if they put red screws on it or whatever, but the actual screws needed to hold the thing in weren't in there, and there clearly wasn't communication of if they should be in there already back then, if Boeing's supposed to do that in final assembly, who's supposed to do what. There wasn't communication about that. And here's the important part, nobody checked for it either. Even if they should have told the people, you need to put in these screws, it's not the honor system. There's human lives in play. You have to check that. Boeing dropped the ball, and that's not the first time. I read reports recently. There was audits being done, and I think right now they're failing about a third of their safety audits for various things that aren't being done right in production. I mean, it's almost beyond repair. And without becoming too political, like you have people out there now giving pretty damning evidence, pretty clear descriptions of this sort of thing that I'm talking
Are you
about.
talking about the DEI stuff?
Yeah, the no, but also this guy who unfortunately committed suicide after a long battle of depression. You know,
Right before he was supposed to testify.
right, they're giving some pretty interesting reports about this, and it's highlighting a lot of really crazy stuff that shouldn't be happening, and the problem happens to kind of be pushed aside. And you could kind of suppose that uh, if testimony like that continues, if all this stuff continues to really reach the surface and become, you know, common knowledge that we all know exactly what's happening, this is going to be a really hard problem to recover from. I would be curious to see if Boeing, as it is right now, I think they're going to be with us, but I think they're going to need some really big bailouts and help to do it because you have these existing problems. They have these planes. Like I said, the 737 Max is a plane they shouldn't be making. It's a plane that should have never been made, and they can't even manage to make that. And we haven't even addressed the elephant in the room, which is it's great that you can make a plane now, which they can't. But even if you could, it's great that you can do it. What are you going to do in 10 years, in 20 years? They haven't come up with answers to that question. They don't have answers to
So
that
they don't have
question.
really any good future development teams or anything.
What they have is the 777 is getting a new version. You can see where this is going. Another old plane getting a facelift. I don't think that's a bad
Kind of
idea.
like Hollywood
Um,
remakes, where they don't have any new ideas; they just keep remaking the old stuff.
Pretty much.
But it's never quite as
The,
good.
the 777, the original version, is a fantastic plane, one of the best to be built. And so, if you do it right, I don't think the remake is a bad idea. It's not like the 737 Max. The plane has a lot of potential. It's a great plane. That's a huge plane, and that's the answer to big planes because these days you just can't have four-engine planes anymore, and that's the answer. Those planes are huge. People don't realize, by
Why?
the way, quick statistics.
Because the four engine planes just use too much gas, or
Exactly. And also maintenance. Engines themselves are expensive and they all need to be maintained too. So it really kind of snowballs on itself there. But quick statistic, I say old, the current version of the 777, the 777-300ER, in its most powerful configuration, which is most of them, each of its engines make 115,000 foot-pounds of thrust. That's more than twice the amount of thrust that many engines on many four-engine planes make. Meaning that 777-300ER, which came out before the turn of the millennium, I think it came out in the late 90s, was making with two engines more thrust than many planes in that market, even produced after that, even produced, I think, into the 2000s,
Right.
made with four.
So why
That's
don't
a statistic
so why don't they just
that.
keep making the 777 if it's a good plane? Can't they just
Oh,
keep
they do.
making it, add some
But
USB ports and
that's why they want to capitalize on it. They want to make
yeah.
the same type of engine, these super huge, powerful engines, powerful enough to make the plane bigger while burning less fuel. That's how they're going to keep selling. That's a good idea, but it's not going exactly well. As you might imagine, typical Boeing fashion. You know, things are scattered across various companies, various departments, no communication, not enough man hours to do anything, missed deadlines, disasters left and right. So it's a good idea on paper. The execution is just not happening. And until they change something huge with their organization, I don't really see how it's going to go very well. Eventually, that plane's going to get, I mean, they have prototype flying around. Eventually, it's going to go into the sky. It's probably going to have problems left and right. It might be grounded a few times. They'll probably sort them out. To me, it's going to keep going like the Dreamliner, like the 737 Max. They don't,
Yeah.
their future looks bad because the best thing about it has problems for really no good reason.
Just because their supply chain is all screwed up and their assembly process and all that. So,
Yeah,
and is this the kind of stuff that the whistleblower is trying to talk about, or
I think that that was probably a more, you know, detailed, specific conversation that he was, or conversations and depositions he was giving about, exactly what happened, with this store, how that happened. But the big picture is important.
yeah,
They sold off company assets in the form of entire sub factories that they shouldn't have sold off. It made some immediate money to that they could put out in dividends and whatnot, but it was a terrible move. And I'm not saying it, I'm not anti-shareholder. Uh, on the contrary, the shareholders should be much happier having a company that has some long-term potential,
unless these
and
guys are making their quick profit and then bailing.
which in the moment was very well possible. But the point is, you could say, hey, maybe they're just trying to profit the shareholders. I don't think so. They could make some money and run, but outside of that, this pretense that they're somehow doing a service to the shareholders is completely false. Unless you were to do that, get your dividends and dump your shares, you're losing money from that
Yeah.
little failed experiment.
So, do you think the whistleblower got Epsteined, or did he really kill himself, or
I mean,
it looks
if
it
if
looks
I
kind of
was
suspicious. I mean,
if I worked years for this company and put up with their crap for that long, and then I made the effort and took the personal risk to go and become a whistleblower, probably also with the hope of saving some future lives, because realistically, this isn't the last incident they're going to have. You would think that, if you're battling depression, you would kind of want to accomplish your mission a little bit more, and at least deliver some more testimony before offing yourself,
yeah.
especially sitting in your, I think it was sitting in a car on the way to deliver it, was this kind of just strange
I
timing,
mean
if you
that
ask me.
gets that. I mean, I don't know how you could make it look even more sketchy than that.
Yeah, I mean, especially since he wasn't like you know assassinated in some weird way. There wasn't a nerve agent, there wasn't a biochemical attack, he didn't die of ricin poisoning 2 weeks after eating something strange. He didn't even hang himself. There was a gunshot wound. Whether or not it was self-inflicted is, hard to know. I don't have much faith that we'll ever get a good answer on that, and I don't really think it matters. But
Did he at least only shoot himself once? Because when they shoot themselves in the head twice, that looks kind of extra
yeah,
sketchy, especially when they jump in front of a train afterwards.
yeah, I'm not familiar with it, but
Yeah,
it could even be once and it wouldn't sit right.
yeah. Well, the world's a strange place. Well, Paul, thanks
Yeah.
for thanks for filling us in on all this. Is there anything else you want to add, or
Um. Well, we'll see how it goes in the future of aviation. Like I said, I spoke about Boeing having some interesting
are
times
there
ahead.
other airlines we need to worry about?
I wouldn't say other airlines in general, but the system is really comfortable having Airbus in the picture, and Boeing used to be in the picture. McDonnell Douglas did too until they merged with Boeing and screwed it up for everybody.
I was flying with United
Um,
a few months back, and just out of Oklahoma City to Chicago in one of those little tiny planes, and they had the one of the luggage racks just kept on popping open. They couldn't get it to lock shut, so they called maintenance to fix it. And so this big old guy just showed on up with a roll of duct tape, just duct taped it up, called it good enough, and off we went to Chicago. And I was thinking to myself, oh my god.
yeah. Yeah, so there's a, I'll tell a quick story about that. There's a, if you want to kind of give people that work in the industry, mainly pilots, if you want to give them some nightmares, just give them, put stickers on things that say inop. Because when things in planes break, they put a little sticker that says inop, stands for inoperable. They
Right,
put stickers on everything. And that's because planes are allowed to fly around with things that don't work. There's a very specific list. It's called the minimum equipment list,
right.
and that specifies what equipment has to work to take off. And it's even like, I don't know the specifics, but if you have two oil pumps, maybe one of them is allowed to be broken and the plane can fly. But if the other one isn't, then they have to not fly until it's fixed. Things like that. Even I think there's a specific number of bathrooms that need to be
Don't
available
they
for.
have to have both oil pumps working just if one fails mid-flight? But I guess
Right, but so I'm not sure that was the best example, but
yeah.
there's in general when they have triple redundancy, that first layer is allowed to be broken.
Okay, I see.
If they only have double and it's a critical system, I think that they have to have both working, but it's something like
And
that.
and it's
And
probably different if you're flying over land versus if you're flying over the ocean.
yeah, exactly. Well, yes and no, because most twin engine planes have that special restrictions over the ocean. If it's four engines, it can do whatever it wants. But
Yeah.
twin engine planes going over water for long distances, that's called ETOPS. It's a whole other world. They have special everything. No, but recently I was on a Lufthansa flight. I like to tell stories like this about Germany because people sometimes get the wrong idea that things work perfectly in that country, that everything's organized. And as you've heard from me in the past, like often not the case at all.
Yeah.
I was very recently. This happened like a little bit more than a week ago. I was on a plane from Munich to Miami with Lufthansa, and this was one of those German incidents I'll never really forget. We're taxiing to the runway, and instead of taxiing onto the runway and taking off, when we get to the end of the runway, they pull off into a little holding pen, and we sit there for a few minutes, and then the engine shut off, and the captain gets on the PA, and he says, "We've just been advised by company that there might be a discrepancy with some of our technical paperwork, and so we're going to sit here and we need to sort it out to make sure that we're allowed to take off."
Because of paperwork.
Right. And so I was talking a little bit with the crew, and half an hour later, we did take off and everything was fine. I did two things. First, I looked on flight radar. You can track not just your flight, but the tail number of planes. You can see what they've been doing. This plane had been in Munich for 3 days straight before, presumably doing some maintenance. And what it seemed had happened is that they didn't properly log all the things that they did on the plane's copy. The plane has a copy of its maintenance log, and the
Right.
company has. And somebody realized at the last moment that they didn't match, and so they had to figure out exactly which version was correct. And because part of the problem was that they had fixed things that they needed to have fixed before taking off,
Right.
and they didn't account for that properly. It's very nice that they actually stopped and verified that instead of just taking off. But it came kind of close. There was a Virgin Atlantic plane in a similar situation with one key difference. They did take off and they turned back to London because something was broken that shouldn't have been broken. So they flew in a 6 hour round trip flight to nowhere. At that point, I think you could just keep going and land at your destination if the plane's in the air. But
Yeah.
who am I to make that call? But that's kind of another example. I'm not trying to compare Lufthansa to Boeing per se, but if you look at what they've been up to lately, they're not pretty either. uh, they have they have more strikes right now than they do days without strikes, so it's a real gamble to fly with them at all, especially during the week.
Yeah.
And when we talk about seating, the passenger perspective on new planes, you pointed out the USBs and everything else, the cabin is a really big component. This is an airline where within Europe, they put a really steep fee on check bags. I think it's like $50 now.
Yeah.
And so nobody checks them, but their overhead bins are much smaller than the American versions because they didn't invest money to upgrade them, so nobody can fit anything. And then every single plane is basically delayed when it's full because they don't know what to do with the bags. And
Yeah.
then they have to take them off and gate check them, and it's this whole chaos. And when we talk about seats, also, they have this new idea. They had this idea like more than 10 years ago for a new long haul cabin called, you know, they have to give it names now. It's not just the new long haul cabin. They called it Allegris because Lufthansa, I've participated in a lot of their surveys. They like to inspire you. They want to talk about, do you feel, they ask you in the surveys all the time, were you inspired by your latest journey? Does this seat inspire you? Is this an experience that inspired you to change something? You know, some complete fantasy crap like that. It's really infuriating, actually. Well, long story short, this Allegris crap was delayed and delayed because they couldn't get their design straight, and they hired way too many consulting companies to do exactly nothing to help them. And now we have this design, which is going to be an absolute shit show when it takes off in about 2 months. They're going to put it in the first planes. It's going to suck. Their business class, in a plane that fits maybe 20 seats in business class,
Hmm.
has 8 different designs of seat. And the goal is to debundle fares that not only do you pay thousands to fly in business class, well now you have to pay to get a nice seat versus a shitty business seat. And the best part is nothing works in that airline. The flights get canceled because of strikes. The flights get canceled also, especially because planes break. So when you pay for your seat assignment, you're probably not going to get it. They're probably going to swap in a different plane.
Yeah.
They have, not including this new fleet, I think in business class alone, they have like 6 different types of cabins in the sky. Like it, that's if you want the airline example of Boeing, I think actually I said I wasn't trying to compare them, but actually it's a good comparison. Lufthansa is heading in that direction too, and that's more and more the case when bean counters take over where they shouldn't. Look at Mercedes. That was a company I cited earlier. Fantastic company making fantastic products. The 90s, even sometimes in the early 2000s, when engineers had control. Now the bean counters take over. The cars, complete crap. New cars are breaking left and right. Mercedes has a real reliability problem.
No
This is why
kidding.
the whole industry has this problem. They get too greedy. They want to save money before they actually make the money, and it screws everything up. So these are 3 companies: Mercedes, Lufthansa, and especially Boeing, where you really wonder. I assume they are going to survive, not on
Oh,
their
I'm
own
I'm,
accord.
I'm sure the government's going to bail them out with my
I'm
tax
sure they're going to bail them
dollars.
up, but you really wonder, like, wow, like what bailout are they going to need? Because I mean, holy crap, it's going to be huge.
Yeah. And I bet they won't have to reform anything to get the bailout either.
Nope. Why would they?
Well,
That would be too smart.
well, hopefully you don't get on one of the planes that falls out of the sky. So I guess the moral of the story is don't fly business class in Lufthansa and stay off the 737 Max.
And by the way, what airline just ordered a bunch of 737 Maxes and Dreamliners?
Lufthansa.
There you go.
All right. Well, Paul, thanks for explaining all this to me. This is a lot of fun, and I'm going to wrap this up here. So everybody, thanks for watching. Like and subscribe to my channel. And if you have any other questions for Paul, put in the comments below, and we will have a follow up. Thank you. Goodbye.